200 Apache warriors stood in perfect silence outside Fletcher Knox's barn, their war paint fresh and their eyes fixed on his front door. But 12 hours earlier, Fletcher had no idea that sharing his last piece of bread would change everything. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Fletcher's weathered ranch as he stepped out of his cabin, wiping sweat from his brow. At 34, he'd learned to read the desert like a book, and today, something felt different. The usual sounds of cattle and wind seemed muffled, replaced by an eerie quiet that made his skin crawl. He was checking the fence line near the creek when he saw him, a small native boy, maybe 8 years old, crouched behind a boulder. The child's ribs showed through his torn shirt, and his dark eyes held the hollow look of someone who hadn't eaten in days. Fletcher's heart clenched as he watched the boy desperately digging through the dirt, probably searching for roots or anything edible. Fletcher approached slowly, his hands visible and empty. The boy tensed like a cornered animal, ready to bolt, but hunger had weakened him too much to run. Without saying a word, Fletcher pulled out the chunk of bread he'd brought for his midday meal and placed it on a rock between them. The child's eyes widened, darting between Fletcher's face and the food, trying to determine if this was some kind of trap. The boy grabbed the bread and devoured it in seconds, tears streaming down his dirt-stained cheeks. Fletcher's throat tightened, watching this small human being reduced to such desperation. He gestured toward his cabin, pointing to his mouth and stomach, trying to communicate that there was more food available. The child hesitated, every instinct telling him to run, but starvation won over fear. As they walked toward the cabin, Fletcher noticed the boy favoring his left leg and the angry red welts across his back that looked like whip marks. Someone had hurt this child, and badly. Fletcher's jaw clenched with anger, but he kept his movements gentle and slow. Whatever had happened to this boy, Fletcher was determined to help him heal. Inside the cabin, Fletcher prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, while the boy sat cautiously by the door, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. When Fletcher handed him the plate, the child's hands shook so violently he could barely hold it. Fletcher sat across the room, giving him space, and watched as the boy ate like he hadn't seen food in weeks. But as the sun began to set, and Fletcher prepared a makeshift bed for his unexpected guest, he had no way of knowing that 20 miles away, a war party was already tracking the boy's scent. The child wasn't just any lost native. He was the nephew of Chief Standing Bear, and the entire Apache nation was searching for him. Fletcher tucked a blanket around the sleeping boy, thinking he was simply doing what any decent human being would do. What he didn't realize was that by morning, his quiet ranch would become the center of the most dangerous standoff the territory had ever seen. Fletcher woke to the sound of his horses snorting nervously in the corral. Something had spooked them, and in his years of frontier living, he'd learned to trust his animal's instincts more than his own. The first pale light of dawn was creeping through his window, and beside him on the floor, the native boy was still sleeping deeply, his small chest rising and falling peacefully. Moving quietly to avoid waking the child, Fletcher grabbed his rifle and crept to the window. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. Hundreds of Apache warriors sat motionless on horseback, forming a perfect semicircle around his property. They weren't attacking, weren't shouting threats. They were simply waiting, like death itself had taken human form and decided to camp on his doorstep. Fletcher's mind raced as he tried to count them. 50, 70, maybe more than 100 warriors, all armed and painted for war. Their faces were stone-cold masks of determination, and their silence was more terrifying than any war cry could have been. These weren't raiders or a small hunting party. This was the entire Apache nation, and they were here for the boy sleeping behind him. The child stirred, probably sensing the tension in the air. When he opened his eyes and saw Fletcher's face, he immediately knew something was wrong. Fletcher pointed toward the window, and the boy crawled over on his hands and knees to peek outside. The moment he saw the warriors, his face went white with terror, and he began trembling uncontrollably. Fletcher realized with growing dread that he'd stumbled into something far bigger than a lost child. The boy wasn't just any Apache. He was someone important enough to mobilize an entire army, someone valuable enough that his disappearance had brought hundreds of the fiercest warriors in the Southwest to Fletcher's doorstep, someone whose safety apparently meant everything to his people. The boy grabbed Fletcher's arm and began speaking rapidly in Apache, his voice high and panicked. Fletcher couldn't understand a word. The child's terror was infectious. Whatever had happened to bring this boy to Fletcher's ranch, whatever had left those whip marks on his back, it had created a situation that could end with everyone dead. Fletcher checked his ammunition. 12 bullets for his rifle, 6 in his pistol. Against 200 Apache warriors, he might as well have been throwing pebbles at a mountain, but running wasn't an option either. The warriors had surrounded the entire property, and Fletcher knew that trying to escape would be seen as an admission of guilt for whatever they thought he'd done to the boy. As the sun climbed higher, Fletcher noticed movement among the warriors. One figure separated from the group, riding slowly toward the cabin. The man was older, with elaborate feathers in his hair and scars that told the story of countless battles. Even from a distance, Fletcher could feel the authority radiating from him. This was clearly a chief, and he was coming to talk. But as the Apache leader approached, Fletcher caught sight of something that made his stomach drop. In the man's weathered hand was a coiled whip, stained dark with what looked like dried blood. The same type of whip that had left those marks across the boy's back. Whatever this negotiation was about to become, Fletcher realized he wasn't just harboring a lost child. He was protecting someone who had apparently escaped from this chief's custody. The boy saw the whip too and began sobbing, pressing himself against Fletcher's leg like a terrified animal seeking shelter. In that moment, Fletcher understood that giving the child back might mean sending him to his death, but refusing could mean war with the entire Apache nation. The Apache chief stopped his horse 20 feet from Fletcher's porch, close enough to speak but far enough to avoid seeming threatening. When he spoke, his English was heavily accented but clear, each word carefully chosen and weighted with authority. "White man, you have taken what belongs to the Apache people. Return the boy, and you will live to see another sunset." Fletcher stepped onto his porch, keeping his rifle lowered but ready. The child remained hidden inside, but Fletcher could hear his quiet sobbing through the thin cabin wall. Every instinct told Fletcher to hand over the boy and save his own skin, but those whip marks burned in his memory like a brand. "The boy came to me starving and beaten. I gave him food and shelter. Nothing more." The chief's face remained impassive, but Fletcher caught a flicker of something. Surprise, maybe even respect, in his dark eyes. "You speak truth, Cowboy. The boy is my nephew, Little Wolf. He ran from punishment 3 days ago. He stole sacred corn from our winter stores." Fletcher felt his jaw clench. Sacred corn or not, no child deserved to be whipped bloody and left to starve in the desert. Punishment for a hungry kid taking food? That's not justice. That's cruelty. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Around the semicircle of warriors, Fletcher could see hands moving to weapons, horses stepping nervously. He'd just accused an Apache war chief of cruelty in front of his entire army, a statement that could start a war or end his life in the next 10 seconds. But instead of ordering an attack, the chief dismounted and walked closer. When he was just a few feet away, Fletcher could see the deep lines of exhaustion etched into his weathered face. And something else, pain that went deeper than physical scars. "You know nothing of Apache ways, white man. Little Wolf is not just any child. He is the son of my dead brother, and the spirits have marked him as our next chief. When he took the sacred corn, he violated laws older than your people's memory of this land." Fletcher's mind reeled as the pieces fell into place. This wasn't just about stolen food. It was about a future leader breaking the most sacred laws of his people. The whipping wasn't cruelty. It was ceremonial punishment required by Apache tradition. But that knowledge didn't make Fletcher feel any better about sending a terrified 8-year-old back to face more pain. If you were Fletcher, what would you do? Honor Apache law and return a future chief to face his people's justice, or protect a scared child from punishment you can't understand? Tell me in the comments. I need to know which side you'd choose. because what Fletcher decided next would determine whether Little Wolf lived to become the chief his people needed, or died as a boy who never understood the weight of his destiny. The chief's hand moved to his knife, and behind him 200 warriors waited for his signal. Fletcher had seconds to decide whether to be a coward who saved his own life or a fool who died trying to protect someone else's child. Fletcher looked into the chief's eyes and made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of stepping aside or reaching for his gun, he set his rifle against the porch railing and held up both hands in a gesture of peace. "Chief, I hear what you're saying about your laws and tradition, but before you take the boy, let me ask you something man to man. Do you remember being 8 years old and so hungry you'd risk anything for food?" The chief's expression didn't change, but he didn't reach for his knife either. Fletcher pressed on, knowing he was walking a razor's edge between life and death. "I'm not questioning your authority or your laws, but that boy in there is more scared than any child should ever be. Whatever punishment your traditions require, maybe there's another way to handle it that doesn't break his spirit completely." For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the desert scrub and the nervous snorting of horses. The chief studied Fletcher's face like he was reading a map, searching for deception or weakness. Finally, he spoke. "You would bargain for the life of an Apache child? What do you know of leadership, white man? What do you know of the burden of teaching a future chief that actions have consequences?" Fletcher felt sweat dripping down his back, despite the morning chill. "I know that scared children make poor leaders, and I know that a chief who shows mercy when it's earned is stronger than one who only knows how to punish." The chief's eyes widened slightly. It was clear that no white man had ever spoken to him this way, with respect but without submission, acknowledging his authority while challenging his judgment. Around the semicircle, Fletcher could see warriors shifting in their saddles, unsure whether to admire the cowboy's courage or prepare to avenge the insult to their leader. "You speak boldly for a man surrounded by death. What would you have me do? Ignore our laws? Pretend that stealing sacred food is acceptable because the thief is young?" Fletcher thought carefully before answering. "No, I think the boy should face consequence, but maybe those consequences could teach him wisdom instead of just fear. Maybe there's a way to help him understand why those laws exist, instead of just making him afraid to break them again." Behind him, Fletcher heard the cabin door creak open. Little Wolf appeared in the doorway, no longer hiding but standing tall despite his obvious terror. The boy said something in rapid Apache, his voice shaking but clear. The chief's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, anger, and finally, something that might have been pride. The chief translated for Fletcher. "He says he is ready to face his punishment, but he thanks the white man for showing him kindness when his own people would not. He says you have taught him that courage sometimes means accepting help from unexpected places." Fletcher felt his throat tighten. The boy was offering to sacrifice himself to save Fletcher's life, and everyone present knew it. The kid had more guts than most full-grown men Fletcher had known, but he was still just a scared child trying to do what he thought was right. But the chief wasn't finished. He turned to address his warriors in Apache, his voice carrying across the desert like thunder. Whatever he was saying caused a ripple of reaction through the war party, some nodding approval, others clearly disagreeing. When he finished, several warriors broke away from the group and rode toward the cabin. Fletcher's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but the chief raised a hand to stop him. "They come not as enemies, cowboy. They bring supplies to help you care for the boy." Fletcher stared in confusion. "Care for him? I thought you were taking him back for punishment." The chief smiled for the first time since arriving, and it transformed his entire face. "Oh, the punishment will come. But first, Little Wolf must learn what you have tried to teach him. That leadership means understanding different kinds of strength. He will stay with you for 1 full moon, learning white man's ways of survival and kindness. Then he returns to face Apache justice, but as a boy who understands both worlds." Fletcher felt his knees go weak with relief, but the chief's next words made his blood freeze all over again. "But know this, cowboy, if any harm comes to him while he is in your care, 200 warriors will return, and this time we will not come to talk." As the Apache warriors rode away, leaving only dust clouds on the horizon, Fletcher stood on his porch, feeling like he'd just survived a tornado. Little Wolf remained in the doorway, watching his uncle's retreating figure with a mixture of relief and terror. The boy understood enough English to know he had a month of freedom, but also that his ultimate fate remained unchanged. Fletcher turned to face his unexpected houseguest, realizing he had no idea how to care for a child, let alone one from a completely different culture who barely spoke his language. The boy was still wearing his torn shirt and worn-out moccasins, and those whip marks needed proper attention before they became infected. "Well, Little Wolf," Fletcher said softly, "looks like you and I are going to be roommates for a while." The boy's eyes filled with tears, but he straightened his small shoulders and nodded solemnly. Fletcher could see the effort it took for him to appear brave, and it reminded him of himself at that age, trying to be a man when he was still just a scared kid. Fletcher spent the morning cleaning and bandaging Little Wolf's wound, using supplies the Apache warriors had left behind. The boy endured the painful process without making a sound, but Fletcher could see him gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles went white. When Fletcher finished, he gave Little Wolf one of his own shirts to wear. It hung on the boy like a dress, but it was clean and whole. Over the next few days, they developed a routine. Fletcher would tend to his cattle and ranch work, while Little Wolf watched and learned, soaking up everything about white man's ways of living. The boy was incredibly smart, picking up English phrases with startling speed and showing Fletcher Apache techniques for tracking animals and reading weather patterns that the cowboy had never seen before. But Fletcher could see the weight of his approaching fate pressing down on the child like a physical burden. Little Wolf would sometimes stop mid-conversation and stare off toward the mountains where his people lived, his young face etched with worry that no 8-year-old should have to carry. One evening, as they sat by the fire eating Fletcher's attempt at cooking Apache-style cornbread, Little Wolf finally spoke about what was troubling him. "Uncle says I broke sacred law. When I go back, elders will decide if I live or die." His English was getting better every day, but his voice shook with fear. "If they choose death, I will never become chief. My father's spirit will be ashamed." Fletcher felt his heart break for this kid who was trying to carry the weight of his entire people's future on his tiny shoulder. "Little Wolf, you made a mistake, but you were hungry and scared. That doesn't make you a bad person or a failed leader." The boy shook his head vigorously. "Apache law says stealing sacred food means choosing personal need over tribe's need. That is not chief's way." Fletcher stared into the fire, searching for words that might comfort a child facing possible execution for the crime of being hungry. But before he could respond, they heard the sound that made both their hearts stop. Horses approaching in the darkness, and lots of them. Fletcher grabbed his rifle and moved to the window. Outside, he could see torches moving through the night, but these weren't Apache riders. These were white men, maybe 20 of them, and they were armed for trouble. "Knox!" a voice shouted from the darkness. "We know you got that Apache kid in there. Send him out, and nobody has to get hurt." Fletcher's blood went cold as he recognized the voice. Jeremiah Wade, the territorial marshal who'd been trying to start a war with the local tribes for months. Wade had somehow learned about Little Wolf and was planning to use the boy as an excuse to attack the Apache. Little Wolf pressed against Fletcher's side, trembling. If Wade got his hands on the boy, it wouldn't just mean Little Wolf's death. It would mean war between the Apache and every white settlement in the territory. Hundreds of innocent people would die because of one marshal's ambition. Fletcher checked his ammunition again and realized that this time 18 bullets against 20 armed men wasn't just hopeless, it was suicide. But as he looked down at Little Wolf's terrified face, he knew he couldn't let Wade turn this brave kid into the spark that burned down everything Fletcher's neighbors had built. The question was, how do you protect a child when an entire army of your own people wants to use him as a weapon? Fletcher's mind raced as Wade's men spread out around his property, their torches creating a ring of flickering light in the darkness. He could hear them talking in low voices, positioning themselves for what was clearly going to be an assault on his cabin. These weren't lawmen coming to arrest someone. They were vigilantes planning to take Little Wolf by force. "Knox, You've got 1 minute to send out that Apache brat, or we're coming in after him." Wade's voice carried the authority of someone who'd convinced himself he was doing righteous work. "That kid's people have been raiding our supply lines for months. Time to send them a message they'll understand." Fletcher knew Wade was lying. The Apache hadn't raided anyone in over a year, not since the peace treaty was signed. But fear and prejudice had a way of making men believe what they wanted to believe, especially when it gave them an excuse for violence they'd been craving anyway. Little Wolf tugged on Fletcher's sleeve and whispered urgently, "I go to them. Stop fighting because of me." Fletcher looked down at the boy's brave, terrified face and felt a surge of protective fury that surprised him with its intensity. "No chance, kid. You're staying right here where you belong." But even as he said it, Fletcher knew they were trapped. Wade's men had him outnumbered and surrounded, and fighting them would just get Little Wolf killed anyway. Worse, if Fletcher shot any of Wade's posse, it would give the marshal exactly the excuse he needed to declare war on the Apache, claiming they'd corrupted a white man into attacking his own people. That's when Fletcher heard something that made his heart leap with hope and terror in equal measure. The sound of approaching horses from the opposite direction. A lot of horses, moving fast through the night. Either the cavalry was coming to restore order, or Chief Standing Bear had decided not to wait a full month before checking on his nephew. Wade heard it too, and his voice took on a note of panic. "Damn it, Knox! You called in the Apache, didn't you? You're a traitor to your own kind." Fletcher almost laughed at the irony. Wade thought Fletcher had somehow summoned Apache reinforcements, when in reality, the approaching riders were probably the last thing Fletcher wanted to see right now. If Standing Bear and his warriors found white men threatening Little Wolf, the fragile peace Fletcher had negotiated that morning would shatter like glass. The sound of galloping horses grew louder, and Fletcher could see Wade's men growing nervous, their torches wavering as they tried to peer into the darkness beyond their circle of light. These were townsmen and farmers, not soldiers, brave enough to intimidate a lone cowboy, but not prepared to face Apache warriors in a night battle. Through the window, Fletcher watched as figures emerged from the darkness on horseback. But as they rode into the torchlight, Fletcher realized with shock that these weren't Apache warriors at all. Leading the group was Sheriff Tom Bradley from the nearest town, followed by a dozen deputized citizens, men Fletcher recognized as honest settlers who wouldn't stand for Wade's vigilante justice. "Marshal Wade," Sheriff Bradley's voice cut through the night like a whip. "By what authority are you threatening citizens on their own property?" Wade wheeled his horse around, clearly caught off guard by Bradley's arrival. "Sheriff, this man is harboring an Apache fugitive. He's violated territorial law and endangered every white family in the region." Bradley rode closer, his hand resting casually on his gun. "I've got a telegram from the territorial governor himself, saying that boy is under official protection, while a peace treaty is being negotiated. You're the one breaking the law here, Wade." Fletcher felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was short-lived. Little Wolf was pulling on his sleeve again, pointing toward the window with wide, frightened eyes. Following the boy's gaze, Fletcher saw movement in the darkness beyond both groups of white men. Apache warriors, dozens of them, emerging silently from the night like ghosts made flesh. Standing Bear had indeed come to check on his nephew, and he'd brought an army. Now Fletcher's ranch had become the center of a three-way standoff between Apache warriors, territorial lawmen, and vigilante settlers. One wrong move from anyone could turn the desert into a battlefield that would be remembered for generations. But as Fletcher watched the chief ride slowly into the torchlight, he realized that Standing Bear wasn't here for war. The Apache leader's face was calm, almost amused, as he surveyed the chaos that had erupted around his nephew's temporary home. When Standing Bear spoke, his words carried the quiet authority of someone who held all the cards and knew it. "White men seem very excited about one small boy. Perhaps we should discuss this like civilized people before someone does something foolish that cannot be undone." The tension in the air was so thick Fletcher could almost taste it. 3 armed groups faced each other in a deadly triangle around his property. Wade's vigilantes with their torches and hatred, Sheriff Bradley's lawmen with their duty and restraint. and Standing Bear's Apache warriors with their silent, lethal patience. One nervous trigger finger could turn this standoff into a massacre that would haunt the territory for decades. Standing Bear dismounted slowly, deliberately, his movements calculated to show he wasn't afraid of any of the white men facing him. When he spoke, his voice carried across the desert night with the authority of someone who'd commanded respect long before any of these settlers had even seen Arizona. I came to see how my nephew learns white man's ways. Instead, I find white men who cannot agree among themselves whether to honor their own laws. The chief's gaze swept over Wade's posse with obvious contempt. Perhaps Apache justice is simpler than white man's justice. Wade's face flushed red in the torchlight, and his hand moved toward his gun. Don't you lecture us about justice. Redskin, your people have been... Marshal Wade. Sheriff Bradley's voice cut through Wade's rant like a blade. One more word out of you, and I'll have you arrested for inciting violence against treaty-protected individuals. Fletcher could see Wade's men looking uncertain now, caught between their marshal's orders and the very real possibility of being arrested by legitimate law enforcement. These weren't hardened killers. They were scared farmers and shopkeepers who'd let fear and prejudice override their common sense. Standing Bear studied the scene with the calm expression of a man who'd seen enough foolishness in his lifetime to recognize it when it appeared. Sheriff Bradley, you seem to be a man of honor. Perhaps you can explain why some of your people wish to steal my nephew when he is already receiving the punishment we agreed upon. Bradley removed his hat respectfully. Chief Standing Bear, Marshal Wade acted without territorial authority. The governor himself confirmed that your arrangement with Mr. Knox is legally binding. These men have no right to interfere. Fletcher felt Little Wolf's small hand slip into his, and he squeezed it reassuringly. The boy was trembling, but he wasn't hiding anymore. Instead, he was watching the three groups of adults argue over his fate with the solemn expression of someone much older than his 8 years. Wade wasn't ready to give up. That boy's people have been raiding supply wagons. He's probably gathering intelligence for future attacks. Standing Bear's expression didn't change, but every Apache warrior behind him shifted slightly in their saddle. Fletcher recognized the movement. It was the same subtle preparation he'd seen in wild animals just before they struck. Marshal Wade, Standing Bear said quietly, my people have taken nothing from yours in over a year. But if you wish to make accusations, perhaps we should settle this in the traditional way. You and I alone, with weapons of your choosing. The offer hung in the air like smoke. Everyone present knew that Standing Bear was offering Wade a chance to back up his accusations with his life. And everyone also knew that Wade would never accept such a challenge. The marshal might be full of bluster and prejudice, but he wasn't completely stupid. Before Wade could respond, Little Wolf surprised everyone by stepping out onto the porch. In clear English, loud enough for all three groups to hear, the boy made an announcement that changed everything. I will speak for myself now. I am Little Wolf, nephew of Chief Standing Bear, future leader of the Apache people. I broke sacred law and accepted punishment, but I also learned that some white men show kindness to enemies, and some Apache warriors show mercy to those who break tradition. Maybe all of us can learn from this. The 8-year-old boy stood on Fletcher's porch, addressing seasoned warriors, lawmen, and vigilantes with the composure of a natural leader. Fletcher felt a surge of pride, realizing that the terrified, beaten child he'd found 3 weeks ago had transformed into someone who might indeed become the chief his people needed. But Little Wolf wasn't finished. His next words would determine whether this standoff ended in peace or bloodshed. Uncle, I am ready to return and face the elders' judgment, but I ask that Fletcher Knox be allowed to speak for me when that time comes. He has shown me that courage comes in many forms, and I want our people to know that not all white men are enemies. Standing Bear's eyes widened slightly. Clearly, he hadn't expected his nephew to request a white man's testimony at his trial. Around the semicircle of warriors, Fletcher could see similar expressions of surprise and, in some cases, respect. But Wade chose that moment to make the biggest mistake of his life. "I'll be damned if I let some Apache brat." The rest of his sentence was cut off by the distinctive sound of dozens of Apache arrows being nocked simultaneously. The message was clear: insult the future chief again, and it would be the last words Wade ever spoke. Sheriff Bradley moved faster than Fletcher had ever seen a man move. In one fluid motion, he drew his gun and pointed it directly at Wade's head, his voice cutting through the night with deadly authority. "Marshal Wade, you are under arrest for violation of territorial treaty law, incitement to violence, and threatening the life of a protected individual. Drop your weapon immediately, or I will consider you a threat to territorial security." Wade's face went white as he realized his own men were backing away from him, unwilling to fight both lawmen and Apache warriors over his personal vendetta. The torches in his followers' hands trembled as they finally understood they'd been led into a situation that could get them all killed. Standing Bear raised his hand, and the sound of arrows being drawn back ceased immediately. When he spoke, his voice carried the wisdom of someone who understood that true strength sometimes meant choosing peace over victory. "Sheriff Bradley honors his word and his law. This is why peace between our people is possible." The chief's gaze moved to Fletcher and Little Wolf on the porch. "My nephew has chosen his advocate wisely. Fletcher Knox, will you speak for Little Wolf when he faces Apache justice?" Fletcher felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about one boy's fate anymore. It was about whether two peoples could learn to trust each other despite centuries of conflict and misunderstanding. "Chief Standing Bear, it would be my honor to speak for Little Wolf. He's shown more courage and wisdom in the past 3 weeks than most men show in a lifetime." Little Wolf stepped forward, no longer the terrified, beaten child Fletcher had found behind that boulder. Standing tall despite his small stature, he addressed both groups of men with the natural authority of someone born to lead. "I return to my people not ashamed of my mistake, but proud of what I learned from it. Fletcher Knox taught me that kindness is not weakness, and that protecting others is the highest form of strength. These are lessons a future chief must know." Standing Bear dismounted and walked to the porch, his warriors following his lead. When he placed his hand on his nephew's shoulder, Fletcher could see the pride and relief in the old chief's eyes. "Little Wolf speaks with wisdom beyond his years. The elders will hear his words and Fletcher Knox's testimony. But I believe they will see what I see. A boy who made a mistake and learned from it, rather than a future chief who failed his people." Sheriff Bradley kept his gun trained on Wade as his deputies moved in to arrest the disgraced marshal. "Wade, you and your men will be held pending investigation. The territorial governor will want a full report on this incident." As Wade was led away in chains, his former followers dispersed quickly into the night, probably grateful to escape with their lives and freedom. The crisis that had threatened to ignite a war had ended not with violence, but with justice and mutual respect. Fletcher knelt down to Little Wolf's eye level, feeling a tightness in his throat as he realized their time together was ending. "You ready to go home, kid?" Little Wolf nodded solemnly, but then surprised Fletcher by wrapping his small arms around the cowboy's neck. "You will always be my white brother, Fletcher Knox. When I am chief, you will always have a place in Apache land." Standing Bear stepped forward and placed a leather pouch in Fletcher's hand. "Payment for caring for my nephew, but more than that, a symbol of friendship between our peoples." Fletcher opened the pouch to find it filled with gold nuggets and turquoise stones, worth more than his ranch and everything on it. But the real treasure was the respect he saw in Standing Bear's eyes, and the knowledge that he'd helped bridge a gap between two worlds that had been at war for generations. As the Apache war party prepared to leave, Little Wolf mounted behind his uncle on the chief's horse. He looked back at Fletcher one last time, no longer a frightened child, but a young leader who carried the hopes of his people and the lessons of an unlikely friendship. 6 months later, Fletcher received word that Little Wolf had faced the Apache elders and been forgiven for his transgression, largely based on Fletcher's testimony about the boy's character and growth. The child who had once stolen sacred corn in desperation was now being trained as his uncle's successor, carrying forward the wisdom he'd learned about the power of mercy and the strength found in unexpected alliance. Fletcher's Ranch became a neutral meeting ground where Apache and white traders could conduct business safely, overseen by the cowboy, who'd proven that sometimes the most important battles are won not with bullets, but with compassion. And on quiet desert nights, when the wind carried the sound of Apache drums across the valley, Fletcher would remember a terrified 8-year-old boy who'd taught him that true courage meant protecting others, even when the cost might be everything you held dear. If you're enjoying these stories, subscribe to the channel. Now click on the video on the screen to hear a story even better than this one, where a single act of mercy changes the course of history itself, and a man discovers that sometimes the greatest victories come from choosing forgiveness over revenge. Click on the video now.